We're going to get the final presentation of the day started for you all, which again is going to be a farmer to farmer conversation between Nathan Anderson and Keaton Krueger. And I would just say that I've spotlighted both Nathan and Keaton. And so if you're looking at them in Zoom, I would recommend you're in speaker view, not gallery view. And in order to change, you can just go up to the upper right-hand corner where it says view and click speaker view. And that way you get to see both of them sort of zoomed in there as they're talking to each other. So unlike the other talks today, this is going to be a conversation between two farmers, and I'm going to sort of sit back and let them take it away. I'll let Nathan and Keaton sort of introduce themselves as they're talking to each other. But to get us started, I'm curious if maybe you both can talk a little bit about your farming operation and then also talk about your general experience level with cover crops and sort of what you're doing, and then we can maybe get into sort of more of the nitty-gritty about your prep for the spring and your planter setup. So Nathan, do you want to start us off?
Absolutely. Thanks. I'm Nathan Anderson. Our family operates Bobolink Prairie Farms in Cherokee County in Northwest Iowa, growing primarily corn and soybeans, some small grains, hay, and a cow-calf operation. And we finish out in direct market beef from that operation as well. So we have some varying uses for cover crops. One of those is grazing, but a lot of our cover crop acres are just part of our cropping system. And for the sake of our conversation today, I'll introduce a little bit of the planters that we use also. So our planters are owned by committee. It's myself, my dad, and my uncle that own planters together. So we have three separate operations. They're distinct operations, but you'll see the same equipment in each of our respective fields. Might be somebody else behind the seat, but it looks the same. So our corn planter is a Case 1250, 24 row, 30-inch planter. No liquid on either of our planters. We have the finger adjust row cleaners. Our soybean planter is a Kinsey 3660, 1631. So a split row soybean planter. So we have 15-inch rows for our soybeans. Again, no liquid setup on that planter. And the same pin adjust row cleaners. The soybean planter does have no-till coulters on it that we can use, but we sometimes do and sometimes don't. So I primarily am a no-till and no-till cover crop system. My dad uses some no-till, some strip till, some minimal one-pass conventional till. My uncle does a little bit of no-till, a little bit of one-pass, and a little bit of two-pass tillage. So these planters are seeing a little bit of a range of planting systems. And so we've no-tilled corn on corn. We've no-tilled corn on corn with cover crops. We've strip-tilled corn on corn. We've strip-tilled corn after soybeans. We've no-tilled corn following soybeans. We've no-tilled soybeans following corn into bare stubble, into some green cover crops, and sometimes into very green cover crops. So that's a little bit of our planter introduction also. What on your operation, what does that look like, Keaton?
Yeah, so I'm much less experienced than Nathan is in this space. So we actually have a small beginning farm. My wife and I both work off the farm in the ag industry as well. And last year, this is the second year of cover crops we have on our operation. So last year we had cover crops that were aerial seeded into standing corn in front of a soybean crop, and then this year we have a different cover crop that we have. It was half wheat and half oats that was seeded last fall aerially in front of our corn. Our planter situation is the reason we changed the cover crop mix up. So we don't have a planter currently. The plan is to gather information, probably some from Nathan today, to set up a planter for the next spring. We're not going to plant our crop this spring. So we have some family members that have a planter. It's a 16 rows Kinsey 3100 planter that isn't really set up for no-till at all. It has row cleaners, but that's really all it has done. So we used that last year to plant the soybeans fairly effectively, but there was some limitations with that planter. So we're actually probably going to do a little bit of light tillage before we plant the corn this year, because the concerns I had in the soybeans wouldn't be good for corn. And then think forward as we build into something going forward. So we can get into that more in detail. That's kind of our experience and what we're using for a planter currently. So we're somewhat limited, although I would say that planting green with a planter not set up for no-till soybeans worked a lot better than I would have anticipated, or the person that owns the planter would have anticipated last year. So it was less scary than we thought.
Yeah, there's a wide range of planter setups, and planters are kind of designed for the average planting condition, and you can say we're maybe above average planting conditions. I don't know how you want to classify it, but we're different than average planting conditions, and so it takes more attention and a little bit more focus. But the average planter can still do at least an adequate job, if not a very good job, planting into a wide range of conditions with appropriate attention, adjustment, and preparation.
The biggest hurdle we had with that planter was we don't have spike closing. We had issues getting the seed trench closed. And he's got props, but so I'm looking forward to this. But like that was the concern that we had going last year. And you know, if we're dropping 140,000 plants per acre on soybeans, we've got more plants out than we needed. I artificially kept the seeding rate higher because I knew there might be some issues. So I'm guessing what compensated for that issue where I probably didn't have perfect emergence because I had some open seed trenches was just having a bunch of extra seed out there. Like I think there's enough data to say you probably don't need more than 90 to 100,000 final stand in soybeans.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to go through before we even get to the closing wheel stuff is if you go back and Lydia, if you could put the link in the chat box. A couple years ago, PFI had Randy Peterson from AGCO give a session at PFI conference. That video is available on YouTube. I watch it every spring. It's a great just refresher to go through the basic mechanical operation of things and things to check on your planter, regardless of planter color and setup. There's really basic things, and those are really important. I mean, the mechanical function of the planter, you know, if your parallel linking arms have worn bushings, you're going to get a lot more play in it. It's going to make it difficult to get the right adjustment, especially if you're strip tilled. It's going to be difficult to hit the strip like you want consistently. You know, worn closing wheels, even if you have something like this, those closing wheel arm bushings, those are worn. Sometimes you can make all the adjustments and it's still challenging to get the setup. So that sound mechanical function, one thing that I think is really important that I would admit that we didn't do enough of early on is indexing our planter row units. When you index your planter row units, you basically block up the gauge wheels, and there's descriptions on how to do this, but you block up the gauge wheels and lower the planter so the row unit is resting on the gauge wheels. So you can use a 4x4 block or 2x4 blocks to block up those gauge wheels over a flat surface, and then you're measuring from the concrete or the ground to the bottom of those disc openers. And if that's inconsistent across the planter, you'll know, or you have an understanding that number one, maybe your disc openers are wearing differently from row to row. So you want to check your disc openers before you do that, or replace them, or make sure they're all consistently the same size. But then you can check and see if this row is at this setting for depth control, is it the same as the row next to it at the same setting? And if it's not, you know, need to look more into what factors might be influencing that. And then another thing that I recently learned to do is index it, then adjust. You know, if you have a case planter, you've got to crank adjust for your depth control. So crank each row, you know, 4 times and see that they all adjusted the same. You know, do it again. And then go through the planter. And if it's a planter that somebody else owns, you're less likely to do this. But if it's your planter, you can put whatever marks on it you want. Like you're entitled to put like duct tape or orange tape and write on it, or the white marking pen and white on it. That this row needs 1.5x adjustment to equal 1x on the rest of the row units. And so I don't know if that's something you have a chance to do this spring with a planter that's owned by a family member, but indexing those row units, I think is really important and often overlooked and I've been guilty of overlooking it too. And it's a bunch of work, so it's really not that appealing, but it's a good
Yeah,
thing.
no, I remember doing that, and I spent a time working at a cooperative where we sold precision planting parts, and that was one of the things we did. And it is a fair amount of work, but I think if it's your planter, and you have time, it makes some sense, especially knowing, if you're we know how to get past the hurdles that no-till creates, because the hurdles no-till creates are predictable when you compare it to a standard tillage program that somebody might have done before. It's just that you have to be more on your game with a lot of the things, because you're going to introduce you're just basically introducing a more stressful, colder seeding environment that's going to be wetter. So you think about what it takes to go around that. I mean, this year we're going to terminate. I don't know what time, as Chad was talking, I was going to terminate 15 days before planting, but now I'm considering maybe I should do it earlier. But and we'll see how this works. It could be a disaster. We're going to just run the final finishing tillage implement over the top of it, the soybean stubble, and try to create a little bit better seed bed that'll be more consistent with what the planter is already going to be set up to seed into. And then, I think about what we do for next year. I had one question for you, and I can't, you maybe said it and I wasn't paying attention, but do you have starter on your planter? Or have you had starter on your planter for
No,
corn?
we don't have starter or any liquid on our planter. And so that's a challenge, and that's one of the drawbacks of a planter owned by committee. Owning by committee, we're able to increase our planting capacity with a better distribution of costs, but then we also have to be in agreement about what modifications are going to be done to that planter. And so that's something that's on my list for the future, because as you're well aware in your line of work also, that anytime you move into no-till, you mentioned that colder and wetter seeding environment, if you can get starter next to that seed, it can make a big difference.
From my perspective, that's one of the goals that I have with the planter. I mean, one of the things I've had the opportunity to do in my role is travel throughout the country. And we all grow, not we all grow corn and soybeans, but a lot of us grow corn and soybeans. But it's amazing how different and nuanced it is as you move north and south and east and west. And that's one thing, as I've moved into southern Minnesota and farther north, starter's pretty normal there. And when I think about our environment here in Ogden, what we're creating with cover crops is probably an environment that's more similar to southern Minnesota or central Minnesota. So to me, it seems like the things that they do just to get their crop out of the ground might work here. And I know that starter is much more common up there. Certainly there's some operational increases at our size. It's not going to be a huge deal, but it seems super logical to me that a starter would be a huge benefit. Pop-up starter would be a huge benefit, and no-till.
So this is, starter is the ideal, but one way that I get around it, I try to compensate for not having starter is this. It's called a stream bar. They're pretty common in wheat country, but they clip onto your sprayer, and then they drop down streams of whatever you want to put through it. So I was glad Chad mentioned when he presented, we use 32% UAN, and we always like to have ATS, ammonium thiosulfate, in that mix ahead of corn, to varying degrees. I think, Chad, you mentioned 5 gallons an acre. Maybe we've used 1.5 gallons to 3 for the most part. But having some of that sulfur with that nitrogen. And one thing you can do with these are set up for a 20-inch spacing on a sprayer bar, but you can get narrower ones that are set up for 15-inch spacing, and then block every other nozzle, and then have these a narrower stream right over your corn row. So with a little bit of plumbing, on your sprayer, you can do that. And they've got a sliding orifice depending on the rate that you're putting out. So for different product, different density, you can slide the gauge and change the flow rate going through it. So that's, for right now, that's how I compensate for not having liquid on the planter, is after planting corn, a little bit dependent on the hybrid and its nitrogen needs and our other fertility that we have available. We're using this, and we always try to target ahead of a rain. Doesn't always work out. But logistically, one of the really nice things I can do with our sprayer, if I'm not trying to tend seed and liquid to a planter, I'm just trying to tend the sprayer with these, I can cover, if I have to, I can do 300 something acres in a day. And
And you're probably compensating a lot with that. I didn't know you had this prop. That makes a ton of sense. If you're doing your own application, that's probably more efficient than starter potentially.
yeah, and there's
Just as far as
drawbacks.
covering acres.
Yeah, and there's drawbacks. You're not getting it right next to the seed. So you've got that shortcoming, but you can get nitrogen that's mobile out next to a corn plant. Again, it's not going to be perfect, but you can get some fertilizer out there targeted in a concentrated stream where you can put a surfactant or a stabilizer or something with it to minimize any potential for volatilization, and have that nitrogen out there, and potentially that sulfur. And you could mix in some of the biologicals or something if you wanted. I think those are a lot more iffy through something like this because their use rates are so much lower that you're not getting it right next to the seed. It might be a little bit more challenging. But when it comes to planting into cover crops, a lot of your nitrogen tie up is, as you're aware, it's that micro decomposition. They're tying up nitrogen because they're trying to digest carbon. And so distributing a food source out there for them is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, and I just thought of two. One is just a passerby comment. We talked about hybrids a little bit. I think it's pretty important to make sure your hybrid selection is optimized, and you're certainly going to, depending on who you're working with as a seed salesperson, they may or may not have the information they need to help you figure that out. But there's certainly a very different rate that hybrids get out of the ground. But you just sent me in another direction. This is not connected to cover crops, but it may be, like, I don't have it tested there. But the other thing I know is if you do tissue samples on early yellow corn, a lot of nitrogen deficiency is actually undiagnosed zinc deficiency early on. That's one thing I think about. Do you do anything with zinc? It's probably pretty hard to do unless you're getting it in the furrow, but even then, it's a commonly missed thing, at least from my experience, that you can solve a lot of your nitrogen deficient seedling corn with some zinc out there.
Yeah, and to step back a degree, we kind of realize that with the sulfur part too. A lot of what looks like maybe nitrogen, pale yellow corn, it's sulfur. So then we've addressed one. The zinc is definitely on the list. One of the things throughout this whole conversation that I think is really important too is I have people smarter than me. Their contact information is in my phone, so I can call them. Like that's a really good thing, because there's people who have been doing specified segments way longer of our whole conversation, way longer than I have. I've got a couple of friends of mine that used to prototype equipment tests for John Deere. Like their numbers are saved in my phone. So I can call them, and dealers, product setup and product support specialists at dealers, they're in there also. So the zinc is another one that, like you mentioned, I'm interested in it, but for the cost and the use rate or the plant uptake rate, I really think it needs to be in furrow. But
I think I would agree with that. I think you'd be, if you're going to get a good zinc product that's going to be chelated and able to be taken up, the cost is going to be prohibitive. You probably don't want to just spray that out there broadcast and hope seed happens to land beside it.
And on the skipping around just a little bit here, but you mentioned the seed selection. Part of having somebody smarter in the phone is also the seed selection part. Having corn product specialists with the hybrid companies that we work with, the product companies that we work with, that our dealers can access or we can access directly is really beneficial for us. Our primary fertilizer program for corn utilizes either turkey litter or cattle compost, and then ammonium thiosulfate and UAN at planting through the stream bar, and then at least one, sometimes two, sometimes three side dress passes. And we're not necessarily adding more nitrogen, except in a few cases where we've got a really good high yield environment and a hybrid that's got a lot of ear flex to it, where we might add a little bit of nitrogen if the conditions are favorable. But we're just splitting up that overall total nitrogen application into varying windows depending on what the plant needs might be. And another way that we do that, I showed the stream bar. We also I call it a poor man's Y drop for our sprayer, but they're a drag hose setup where I took drop nozzles and then framed them across, just X'd them across with drag hoses behind it. So I can drop them down in the corn canopy. Those hoses have a little bit of pressure going out. They can dribble corn or dribble nitrogen closer to the stalk of that corn plant. And again, I can do it with my sprayer, and I take the steps off my tractor. I take the jack off the sprayer, and I can go through like V10 or so corn. Can go into some pretty tall corn with it, and get nitrogen out later. And that's not necessarily the planting part of the discussion, but it is part of the planting green and cover crops part of the discussion of where we split that up.
I want to I want to shift a little bit. You said planting green again. And I had there's one note, and I just want to tell the story of in case somebody in the call hasn't done this a lot, like my first year planting green into soybeans. Uh, um, I've learned a lot from Chad today, but I think that the one little thing that I'll share that I learned last year was planting worked well. Like I said, we had good cereal rye. It was 100% cereal rye. We terminated at planting with our regular residual and glyphosate. Had really good success terminating, and we didn't have any weed cover really to speak of. So, when we come back with our post pass, we did two things. One, we decided to leave out the enlist because the field was completely clean. So we came back with a one residual product in glyphosate, but I'm not doing my own spraying. So the cooperative, we decided to spray, and then it took 10 days to get out there. And in that time, we had all that water hemp that I held back on the spring break, and we had a water hemp disaster because the glyphosate wasn't able to control it because it was too big. And I built up my water hemp seed bank for the next decade last year with that. So we'll be working through it, but I think it's key to make sure that remember how fast water hemp can grow, and if you don't have control of the timing of your sprayer, just factor that in. Yeah. The other thing I think that's important to note just on that is the inconsistency in burn down is somewhat due to antagonism with glyphosate and UA, and you can see that. But I think the other thing that's commonly missed is just correct adjuvant rates and quality adjuvant products, where you can make a herbicide pass succeed or fail pretty easily just by messing up that component of it, which is often an afterthought for a lot of people. I'm guessing it's not for Nathan, but for a lot of people, sometimes we don't think as much about the adjuvants as we do about the active ingredients.
Yeah, and it can be. One other thing is water. We have 3 different farms that we can pull water from, well water, and they're different wells. One's a 40-foot surface, one's a 280-foot, and the other one's a 370-foot well. And there's different water quality at each one.
If you did just a quick jar test on all 3 of those, I bet you'd have very different levels of precipitate depending on the product.
Yeah, we haven't done a jar test, but we've done just some of the water quality tests on them. And there's significantly different needs for adjuvants for each of those water sources. And so one of the things that I like to use, and it falls under the adjuvant category, but some type of water conditioner pH adjustment, so you can get that consistency as you're pulling from different water sources, even if you're pulling from the same water source, but just to get that consistency in pH and water softness, from application to application, and especially with surface water wells, seasonally, you're going to see fluctuations in that water hardness and pH. So I think that's something important. The other thing, I keep showing this prop, but another thing with a stream bar is it forces me to separate my herbicide application from my fertilizer application. And that can be a drawback because I'm making 2 passes with the sprayer now, but it is a benefit when it comes to consistency of weed control and consistency of herbicide performance.
I think if you're working with an ag retailer, like they certainly have more, I think my experience, they have more adjuvant knowledge than they sometimes offer up when they make the first connection with a farmer, because most farmers don't actually think about it a whole lot. The group that populates these kind of calls probably does more than average, but I think sometimes I have to ask them, like, if I'm going to work with a new one, and we have some farm ground in Southern Iowa also, the one thing I want to make sure you know is I don't want you to skip on adjuvants. Like, I don't necessarily know what the right ones are, but what I want you to do is make sure that that extra $4 I can spend to get the full rates is important, because if I'm going to put 30 or $40 into the applications, an extra $4 might make or break it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
back,
It's amazing to me, your glyphosate cost per acre might be $2.50 to $3 an acre, depending on where you're getting it and your source and your cost. And your adjuvants might be $5.50, $7 if you've got really hard water you need to address. But your adjuvants could easily be $4. You can spend more on adjuvants, and if you're not spending that money, your money on your herbicide might well be wasted. So
I want to shift back to, so you've got your planter. If you were setting up the planter, the primary planter you wanted to use, Nathan, what would you set it up like? But I mean, money is an object here. Like, don't make the
yeah.
most expensive one, but like, what are the key things you're going to focus on if you're setting up a new planter to work in a standard cover crop environment going forward?
So if I had to build my ideal planter, and money was no object, or a minimal object, as far as openers go, I really like the case openers. That offset, you've got a leading edge, trailing edge disc opener versus the John Deere and Kinsey, where it's a matched disc opener. That's just me. They can both work well, but I like that leading edge offset that just gives me a little bit more cutting action, in my opinion, without requiring as much increased down pressure. And you can also you can get better flow of residue and soil through that system. So I would have floating row cleaners, hydraulic downforce, a case base. I would like narrower gauge wheels. I understand in some instances, if you get too narrow on your gauge wheel, you can increase the compaction right around that row unit, that seed trench. So minimize that a little bit, but I'd still want to get the narrower gauge wheels if possible. The Mudsmith ones would be great, so you can get flow through there. Have good adjustment on the disc openers to those gauge wheels. Make sure your gauge wheel arms are not worn, and you have them washered and spacered correctly. The closing setup. So one thing I always like to do on the closing is, when I first go and plant, I just tie up all of the closing wheels. Just tie up everything. Take all the down pressure off, lift them up. And then you can plant, and then you can see your seeds in the unclosed seed trench and see that things are consistent before you cover it back up. And then you can see spacing, you can see depth. You can see a little bit of ride angle. If you've got worn parallel arm bushings, you can see a little bit of that in it. But so that's one thing I like to check too. But getting on the closing side, I'll take one step back on the gauge wheels. The reduced inner diameter gauge wheel is really important. So you've got a space for that soil to go when the disc openers are opening it up, and help minimize some of that sidewall compaction. Closing, I have mixed feelings on closing. I like, they're set up to make a case planter close more like a John Deere planter, and they're set up to make a John Deere planter. There's aftermarket stuff to make a John Deere planter close more like a case planter. So clearly we can go through the whole thing if we want to, but I like the case inverted disc wheels that pull soil back in. And the single closing wheel on the case is nice, but in certain circumstances, it doesn't work quite as well. And that's where I like more of a spike closing wheel like this, probably doubled up and then a drag chain behind. But that would be ideal. And I think if I were to put fertilizer too, I would probably just do the total. I see Tim mentioned in the chat box, the totally tubular, do that in furrow, and I'd leave the 2x2 off. And that's just my preference from a logistics standpoint, and a weight standpoint a little bit too, where in furrow, I'd be using a lot less material than a 2x2 setup. So I would, if I were going to do that, I'd like a 2x2x2. So I'm getting fertilizer both sides of the row. But that would be.
Yeah, and from your perspective, since you're already applying your own fertilizer, right? Like
Yeah,
that's already kind of baked into the system.
yeah.
So,
And we
um,
have, again, this is part of a farm operation that includes myself, includes dad, includes my uncle, where we have a lot of control over. We have the turkey litter spreader, so we control when that goes out, or the cattle compost. We have the sprayer, so I can control when I spray and when I fertilize. And we have a tractor on the corn planter and a different tractor on the bean planter, so I can go plant either one of those depending on the conditions. And that's something that may not be as possible with farm size differences, but that's something that having this shared equipment, there's limitations, but there's also some benefits too as well. Um, and again, pros and cons, and just weighing those.
Lydia, we hit 11:45, like almost perfect. Is this where we're supposed to stop for questions?
You guys can keep going a little bit. I have a couple questions, but then I'll let you guys continue on. One clarifying question for both of you, but Nathan, have you found a lot of big differences when you're indexing row to row on your planter like you talked about?
Yes, sometimes. And I would say probably the biggest differences row to row that I have seen are ones where, we were maybe last to end up last year. You're supposed to crank it one time and somebody only cranked it a half a time or 1.5 times. So it's just a settings adjustment. And the other ones that I would say the biggest kind of true difference is either out at the very ends or on the row units that ride behind the tractor tires in our interplant setup, where we see a lot more wear in those parallel arm bushings. And I think because of that, we're seeing more wear in those gauge wheels. And that's kind of translating down to those disc openers. So most of the time, they're relatively close, but it's a good thing to check. And I was going to comment on this too, is that, I have both planter tractors, the corn planter is 24 rows, it's 60 foot wide, the bean planter is 40 foot wide. I have GPS in the tractors. I can plant a lot of acres in a hurry if I need to. That also means if I'm not set up right, I can screw up a lot of acres in a hurry if I don't do it right. And so taking a lot of time to dig out in the field is a really good thing. My last prop, get one of these if you haven't. This is Iowa Soybean Association one, but there's a wide variety of them. Also, just for fun, just lay multiple ones next to each other, because sometimes the 1-inch one is not the same as a 1-inch one on another one. So get a good quality one of those if you can also. And then the same applies like on the fertilizer and the spraying. If it's a time that's fit to spray cover crops, I will park the planter, shut it off, and go spray cover crops to terminate cover crops when they need to be terminated. And that's a pretty important thing too.
I'm curious. Okay, another question that came in is going back. Keaton, you mentioned your thoughts about running a finisher over a dying cover crop. Nathan, there's a question here. Have you seen any issues with like planter hitting roots or root balls, or like, is that not a big deal for you in any of your sort of tillage situations?
Yeah, it definitely can be. And I would say it's a lot bigger issue with our soybean planter that's coming after corn. The prior year corn crop. And so that's why I saw Chad was talking about planting at an angle to his cover crop. And that's 100% okay. We used to plant our beans that way at a little bit of an angle across the corn rows. And that's where we ran into issues where those gauge wheels, as they went over the root balls, would lift up and you'd see a shallower planting depth across that row unit. And so now again, with GPS, it makes it a little bit easier, but we run our two 15-inch soybean rows right down between our 30-inch row corn stalks from the year before. And so it takes a little bit of work. Sometimes there's a little bit of play in the GPS, so you're making some adjustments, but yeah, it's pretty important to do that. I think if you have the right tillage, light tillage pass, especially over stuff that it was soybeans last year. Is that correct, Keaton?
Yeah, for us, I'm actually not as I'm concerned, but I'm not like I'm pretty concerned about not messing up the corn crop. So this is a measured risk. We did half oats, half winter wheat. So the oats are going to be gone this spring. They they didn't overwinter, right? And the wheat's not going to grow quite as aggressively as cereal rye. So we'll see. I'm looking out the window now. It's just starting to turn green. But I think that I would be much more nervous with the root ball concern if I was running it through cereal rye that was 100% stand of cereal rye considered, other than a 50% stand of wheat. But we'll see. I'm hoping that wheat, when we hit it with the burn down, um, burns down faster than rye would, because it's a little bit more of a delicate plant.
And if those root balls are loose, that's where your row cleaners come in. That's they're to move that stuff out of the way. So
One other question that came in, and then I want you guys to continue to, if you have other things that you're like, oh, I really want to share this, like or Nathan, I know you said you're done with props, but if you do have another prop, um, but Becca, and I think this is a great question, was wondering, are you making any sort of adjustments for cover crop termination timing with your planter for this sort of low soil moisture this spring?
So I'll go really quick because I just thought about this yesterday. Right now, I'm more optimistic we may not have as low soil moisture, because if you look at the measurements in our area, they're increasing far faster than I thought, and we've got some good moisture this week. I'm glad I don't have a full stand of cereal rye out there, also because of that concern for me this year. Like, I think the wheat's not half a stand of a less aggressive crop. I don't know. We'll see when we get to termination. I think of what Chad said, like, if you have you're maybe better off not to terminate it if you have a cold spring coming. The plan still is to terminate 15 or 20 days ahead of planting, but I think over the next few weeks we'll have to decide that. So I'm curious to see what the weather forecast does. What do you think, Nathan?
I'm interested to see how much of my cover crop actually survived. We had very poor germination last fall with as dry as we were. We are getting some moisture, but we're still, as of the fall, we were like 3 inches of subsoil moisture, and last year we were 10 inches. So just the odds of getting an additional 7 inches of rainfall, given the current forecasting outlooks, an additional 7 inches of rainfall on top of what we actually need to grow the corn crop. I don't go to a casino much because I farm and I don't have to. But the odds would say I don't think that's going to happen. And that can all change really quickly. But I think I'm going to be terminating earlier for the most part relatively than I have in the past. I am probably not going to be doing a delayed termination study in soybeans, where I wait to terminate the cover crop until after the soybeans are planted. And I am going back and forth a little bit on planting depth, particularly with corn. Deeper planting depth, you can get those secondary root development a little bit deeper in the soil. And no-till, you can kind of run into some stratified nutrients because you're surface applying a lot of things. So I'm kind of weighing those different factors and trying to decide what I should do. And that's, we're a month plus. I shouldn't say a month plus. We're a month away from making that decision. But that's kind of a field level decision. No-till, cooler soils, deeper planting means more emergence risk. But the forecast right now is warmer than average and drier than average. So for at least the first part of spring. So I would say, given that, I'm probably going to be planting a little bit deeper and terminating cover crops a little bit earlier.
I think good point he just said there is, assessing the stand. I don't really know what stand I'm going to have either. It looks greener than I expected, but it's pretty early. It was pretty terrible last fall. So, if I don't have much stand out there, a lot of my concerns won't be even valid because there just won't be much to deal with.
Mm-hmm. I think that's where I'm going to play in. A lot of my September seeded cover crops, which I even cut back on how much I was going to do then, with as dry as we were, those didn't make it through fall. And so then I broadcast some rye late with fertilizer just to try and get something to grow this spring. Now I'm talking about terminating it early. Maybe wasn't a good use of my dollars, but trying to get something to grow out there. So.
One last question that's come in that I'm wondering, Nathan, if you could elaborate more on closing wheels, you talked about some of the differences, but what have you experimented with, and can you just talk more a little bit about those?
Yeah. So I haven't experimented with too many different kinds of wheels. We have on our case planter, there's a single fat rubber tire, basically with a kind of a checker pattern or a herringbone pattern going around it. So that's the standard one on our corn planter. That's what we've used. The soybean planter initially, when we got it, it had two rubber wheels on it. We left it that way for the first season. Again, some of our beans are no-till, some are one-pass tilled. So wanted to see how that worked. The second season we put these copper heads on one side and left the rubber one on the other side. Again, trying to address some no-till, some cover crops, and some tilled, trying to kind of get the best of both worlds there a little bit. There's a whole lot of options. These are the ones that I had access to, so they're the ones I put on. Yetter makes the poly twisters, Schaefer makes a couple, Martin makes them, Copperhead makes them. There's a bunch of different ones, and I think some of the data would say, especially in no-till and no-till cover crops, that anything you can do besides the standard two rubber tires is going to be helpful. And Chad had a question about drag chains. I saw drag chains in one per row, so I just run one per row on the closing side. I don't have drag chains right now. I'm not sure if I will or not. In tall cover crops, maybe it's not a plus. In shorter cover crops or in no-till or variable tilled soils, maybe it'd be beneficial. Not sure. We'll see.
Thanks, Nathan. And Keaton, one last question for you. Chad was wondering, what led you to start using cover crops initially, and sort of talking about, especially with Becca talking about goals, did you have any specific goals with cover crops?
That's a wonderful question. The short version is so my day job is working in with ag retail. I involved in the Corn Growers Association on the Ag and the Environment Committee there, and really the driving factor was we moved to my wife's family farm. We were going to start doing a little farming here. At my mom and dad's house, cover crops in southeastern Iowa is a much more common practice. I didn't see a lot of it around here, and I talked to the farmers, in the Corn Growers Association that I spend a lot of time with, and I got two different. So there's farmers that I respect and I know run very strong businesses and very good agronomic businesses that said, cover crops have changed the world for me, and it's the best decision I've ever made. Then I've got another group of farmers that also run very profitable, good businesses agronomically that said, I tried it. It's not quite as good as everybody says it is. It may work for some people. And I'm like, well, these both can't be true, right? These individuals are both running very strong operations. So, the one thing that was consistent was the ones that were the most passionate about it said it takes 4 or 5 years to really see if it works. And my personal beliefs about conservation and better management and stewardship makes me want cover crops to work. So I decided, well, we're going to start here farming. We're just going to do it for 5 years and see how it works, and then we'll make a decision. So that's the long version of the story. So we'll just do it on our own and see how it works out.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I hate to cut us off, but we are at time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's lunch hour. Thank you so much, Nathan and Keaton. This was really informative. I really appreciated you guys just like getting into spring setup and planter details. I learned a lot, and so I really appreciate you taking the time to share with everyone.
Thanks, Keith.
Wonderful. Yeah,
Great to
I learned. I got lots of notes here also. So
yeah, same.
Good. Okay, before everyone leaves, don't leave yet. I just have a couple wrap-up items before everyone heads out for the day. Firstly, I failed to mention this at the beginning, but we are offering CEU credits for the bootcamp today. So if you're here and you'd like CEUs, please email Sarah Carlson at sarah@practicalfarmers.org by 5 p.m. today with your name and your certified crop advisor number. I also want to mention that we do have cost share for both small grains and cover crops. Please note that these need to be on separate acres. But if you are growing cover crops or you're growing small grains for production, please head to these links. You may be eligible for one or both of these cost shares. So head to these links, fill out an application, and then we will follow up with you. And lastly, I just want to thank you all for joining us today and sticking with us for the 2 hours. This was really wonderful, and we will be sending out an evaluation to everyone's email. We really appreciate getting feedback. It helps us plan great programs and events. And so if you have a couple minutes, we just would really appreciate it if you could fill that out and help us plan for the future. And I'll stick around if anyone has any other questions or comments, but otherwise enjoy the rest of your day and good luck this spring. Thank you.